I'm Bill Reisinger. I'm a member of the board of the ICFRC and chair of the program committee, and I'll be hosting today's program. We thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible. I also want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, University of Iowa International Programs, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization, all of which provide vital financial support to us. I also thank today's special sponsors, Midwest One Bank, Allison Ken Atkinson, and Mason K. Braverman. Thanks also to City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs and getting slideshows set up ahead of time. Our programs are cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2 and are also available in the U of I Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. So our format today is the usual one. Following our speaker's presentation, at about 1 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A with written questions submitted from the audience members. Please note that we request questions be submitted in writing because questions from the floor cannot be picked up by City Channel 4. You can write your questions on cards that are available at your table. Following the conclusion of the speaker's remarks, our interns will then pick up those cards and bring them to the front for the Q&A session. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Chris Rossi. He directs Humanities Iowa and has served as an adjunct faculty member in the U of I Law College for many years. He has a Ph.D. in International Relations from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has an LLM in International Law from the University of London, and most prestigiously, a J.D. from the University of Iowa. He's worked on deterrence issues for a division of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and on verification issues at the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. He has taught at American University, the University of Northern Iowa, the Mongolian Diplomatic Academy, and Pusan National University. He served on the White House National Security Council as Director of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. He has published articles on the law of war, legal history, international courts and criminal tribunals, polar affairs, Latin America, and on the law of the sea. He has co-edited 2 books on international affairs and authored 4 others. His latest book is entitled Whiggish International Law, Elihu Root, the Monroe Doctrine, and International Law in the Americas, that came out just this year. We're very fortunate to have him present to us today. Please join me in welcoming Chris Rossi.
One of the oddities of life in the Americas has to do with the Armada Boliviana. The Bolivian Navy has a fleet of 90 vessels, 4,600 sailors, 2,000 Marines, a naval aviation accompaniment, and yet it has no coastline to protect. Bolivia lost its coastline 140 years ago and has not gotten over that. Bolivia lost its coastline, which measured about 400 kilometers, in a devastating war, along with its ally Peru, against Chile. One of the ironies of that war was before that war began in 1879, when Bolivia had a coastline, it had no navy. When the war began, Bolivia depended upon Peru's navy to fight the Chileans, and the Chileans did not decimate the Peruvian navy, it annihilated the Peruvian navy. That's not all the Chileans did. It took the entire coastline of Bolivia. It went north and took the regions of Tacna and Arica, and then it went farther north to occupy Lima for 3 years. When it receded, it meditated on the idea of keeping both Tacna and Arica in what Latin Americans refer to as Chileanization. But after a tortuous period of time, including intercession by U.S. arbitrators and negotiators, Peru received Tacna, but Chile kept Arica. And in doing so, it forced a circumstance for the Bolivians that they have yet to accommodate. They are now a nation of landlubbers, and they want their sea back. They persistently argue that their territory was wrongfully taken by the Chileans and forces of international economics that had allied with the Chileans to deprive the Bolivians of their natural-born territory. Last year, before the International Court of Justice, the Bolivians brought a case against Chile. They lost badly, but the Bolivians continue to this day to argue that the injustice regarding the taking of its territory needs to be remediated. Now, there are a couple of descriptions or understandings for why this happened. One that is particularly favorable in Latin American circles has to do with basically an analogy to Shakespearean forms of dramaturgy. There are plays within the play going on here. When Bolivia sued Chile before the International Court, it was obviously looking for an international audience to base the righteousness of its claim on. But Bolivia was also satisfying internal politics as well. And that regards the play within the play that happens in many forms of interaction. And so the audience for this Bolivian complaint is oftentimes an internal audience. The audience is basically those people internal to the country, and the objective is to shore up support internally for domestic governments or policies by creating some sort of external or foreign affairs crisis. It's a common kind of description of how international politics gets played. But I prefer to think about this in a different kind of way, because if it's all just a smokescreen regarding internal politics of Latin America or the Andean cone countries, once the smokescreen evanesces or gets blown away, you would think that the problem would be solved. But I think there are deep structural problems relating to the configuration of our geospace in the Americas that contributes to this problem even today. And that's what I want to talk to you about, although, because I haven't quite worked out in my mind the backwaters and eddies of my thought, the river of my discourse is going to meander, if you like my riparian metaphor. But I've been actually meditating on ideas of remoteness and geospace. The geocartography of our world informs the structure that we are born into and the structure that remains regardless of when the politics sort of blow away. And to tell you this story, we need to know a lot about history, and we need to know a lot about the deserts, because the big complaint about Bolivia is that its desert territory, called the Atacama Desert, was taken away from it by the Chileans, and they want it back. But they don't want it back, or they didn't want it back, simply because it was desert sand. It turns out that the Atacama Desert is the gift that keeps on giving. And trillions of dollars worth of resources are in the Atacama Desert, and that's one of the reasons why Chile is not going to give it back. I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about the idea of remoteness and how things that are remote in our political forefront, things that are on the periphery, don't seem to engage us because they seem to be distant. Only until the time when they are no longer distant, when resources magically appear, making that distant territory incredibly valuable. I'll give you just one modern example. 10 years ago, There was no way that a commercial vessel could go from China to the biggest port in Europe, Rotterdam, by venturing through the Arctic waters of the Northeast Passage. Now, all of that water is open for a period of time. And the Russians, if you just saw last week, are putting nuclear vessels up there to keep that waterway open, to engage in that traffic that was so remote and so peripheral that nobody 10 years ago even thought of the possibility of doing this. But now it's a reality. And that's the kind of story that I want to tell with regard to the Americas. The Atacama Desert is the driest habitable place on Earth. It is so dry, it is so arid, it is so remote, it is so sequestered by the Andes on one side and the largesse of the Pacific Ocean on the other side that for years and years it had no value. It has no value even today except for NASA scientists who take their Mars rovers down to the Atacama Desert and they test drive them. Astrochemists drill into the Atacama soil because it is so devoid of life. They search for microbial evidence of life, and they're testing their sensors to probe the universe. And of course, the Atacama sky is so dark and beautiful and pollution-free that the biggest telescopes in the world are down there searching into the universe. It has real value in that respect, and the scientists use it. But other than that, it was and remains a place of extreme aridity, no rain. In understanding how we came to the idea of this place, we need to know something about our forebearers who brought to this continent conceptions of space. And of course, we have to look to the Europeans. I know it's a big problem with periodization among historians, but let's just start with 1492. It's not when the Americas began, it's when the Americas began from a European perspective. When Columbus discovered Hispaniola. And from that point in time, a dramatic reorientation of the Western mindset began. And it brought with it a conception of deserts that were informed by travelogue writers of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. These travelogue writers would venture to the Holy Land in caravans, and they would go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and then the rich ones would find what were called Saracens, non-Christian guides, to take them into the desert of the Exodus, to the Abrahamic home of religion, to the Mount Sinai, to the base of Mount Sinai. And then from there, they would traverse back home to the Red Sea, to Cairo, to Alexandria. Then they would hitch a ride from Venetian traders back to Europe. And in doing so, one of the most famous travelogue writers, a guy by the name of Felix Fabry, told the story of the desert because Europeans had no conception of a desert. And everything that Fabry wrote about deserts was bleak. It was a wasteland. He couldn't believe how bad it was. And he wrote about it, and they're page after page after page. And we have a librarian here, Brett Cloyd, who's helped me find these books that Fabry wrote. They are actually very delicate, and they are being refurbished by the people at the main library. And I'm reading these things, 100 pages of description of deserts and how terrible it is. And this was main reading all throughout Europe. It was a new world. And when Fabry wasn't writing about this for a generic audience, he was writing about it for scholars. He wrote 4 versions of this story for different audiences, and it became very popular and very mystical. Not only that, I was reading at the library down the street, he saw a unicorn, and he wrote about a unicorn. Not everything that Fabry wrote was necessarily true, but it piqued the European imagination, and in terms of desert, it was bleak. the second part of the story comes about shortly after 1492. A German fellow by the name of Martin Waldseemüller made a map. He made a map that changed the orientation of the world, and he made it in 1507. This is Waldseemüller's enormous reconfiguration of the world that was given to us by, you can't see him very well, but this fellow up here, Claudius Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic vision of the world had a map. It had 3 continents in it. But now all of a sudden in 1507, a German monk doing business in France comes up with this new cartography, a new vision of the world that rearranged our notion of space that had been constant for 1,400 years. That's why many cartographers and geographers look at this 1507 map and say this is the most important map in the history of the world. And that's not hubris. They're talking about the way in which Waldseemüller, shortly after the discovery of the Americas, came up with a cartographic depiction of our world, which is astonishing. It's even more astonishing to geographers and cartographers than you can imagine because, and this is, you got to zoom in on this, and I'm sorry that I don't have the capability to do it, but you can see on the left-hand side of this map is the New World. You can see Africa is pretty well understood. And Asia is kind of a mumbo-jumbo, but Europe's pretty well understood. And when you look at the detail, there's a lot of detail in those areas, but there's no detail in the Americas. In fact, if you zoom up, and I can't, it says territory unknown. All they know is that this belongs to Spain. The other thing that's very important about this map is that if you zoom in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see in South America, there's a word. It's right here. It's right here. You can't see it, but it says America. This is the birth certificate of the Western Hemisphere. That's another reason why it's important, but that's not the reason why it's most important. The reason why it's most important is because Waldseemüller creates a projection of our world about which he knew very little in a pretty good way that shows 360 degrees of circumference. This is the first time you see the world is round. This is the first time that he actually depicts the Pacific Ocean. And nobody knows how he did that because Balboa didn't discover it when he made this map. And he also shows that you can sail around the southern tip of South America, and Magellan hadn't done that either. He's also showing open water in North America, atop North America, and atop Asia. He doesn't know that, or does he? Nobody knows how he did that, or why he did that, or whether he was just goofing around, or whether he knew something that somebody else didn't know. Maybe the Spanish had explorations that they never talked about, but basically, he projected a round world. He also made globe gores, these little carvings that you turned into a globe. There are 2 of them in the world. There's only 1 of these in the world, Library of Congress. But the globe gores are actually, one's in Munich and the other one's at the University of Minnesota. So it's worth a day trip. This is an astonishing map. But the reason why I want to talk about it is because he doesn't know what's going on in the Americas. All he says is this territory unknown. And he's making this claim that it's all belonging to Spain because Spain and Portugal in 1494 made a deal and the Pope blessed it. Anything to the west of a line drawn in the Atlantic, anything west belonged to Spain. Anything east belonged to Portugal. They could only figure out where that line was, and not very well, when it was drawn in the Atlantic. They didn't know where the line was on the dark side of the earth because they couldn't figure out longitude mathematically for another couple hundred years. So the Europeans are having this idea about space, and they don't know what they're talking about. Even Waldseemüller, you can't see it very well, but between North America and South America, he has a gap. He draws the Panama Canal 400 years before the Panama Canal was made. Now we know that's a mistake. And we also know at the time, by this time, 1507, Columbus had sailed the ocean blue 4 times, searching desperately to find this opening. It didn't exist. They knew it. But he drew that, and so that's a little curio as well. This map tells us a lot about the way the Europeans thought. It didn't matter what was there, Spain owns it. And there are tens of 10, 20 million square miles of territory that all seemingly belongs to Spain. Now, 9 years later, Waldseemüller makes another map. And this map is also astonishing, but for different reasons. His map in 1516 is the famous Carta Marina. It's a nautical map using Portland technology for a different reason. 9 years later, Waldseemüller has a completely different look at the world, because this political objective is to talk about what he wants to talk about. And everything here is pointing to Asia. So much so that if you really blow up this map, the Carta Marina, you see that Waldseemüller has retracted 128 degrees of spatial projection. There is no reference here to the Pacific Ocean. There is no reference here to the west coast of the New World and to much of South America. And even the toponym that provided the Western Hemisphere's birth certificate has been removed. He renamed us. You can't see it, but in the upper left-hand corner, it reads Terra de Cuba, Asia Partis, territory of Cuba, part of Asia. So he's reconnected the Columbus idea that the New World was connected to Asia. But 9 years before, he had not done that. Why is he doing this? Because he has a different conception of remoteness and place and space, and it's all based upon the politics of what happened in between. This was a tremendously interesting world that was changing vibrantly. And if you look at the decoration and the detail that Waldseemüller provides in this 1516 cartographic Carta Marina, you will see that the detail is beautiful. And he's looking at things that he hadn't seen before. But the most important thing about this, in this woodcut, you see an image of the King of Portugal, Manuel I. He's riding a sea monster. Not only is he riding it, he has it bridled, like a bucking bronco. It looks like a bucking carp. But what that signifies is that the Portuguese have tamed the seas. The Portuguese have, not only have they tamed the seas, one of the predecessors, a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama went around the tip of Africa and he caught the trade winds, this phenomenon called the Roaring Forties, and it slingshotted him all the way over to Asia, and it changed the world. Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese were now over in Asia for the reason why Marco Polo told them to go. Marco Polo told them that there were spices over there. There was emporium. There were fortunes to be had. And the Portuguese unlocked the Atlantic Code trade winds, and they claimed them for themselves, leaving the Spaniards to that other open space. Who cares about that? For the moment, it was all Asia. And when the Portuguese did that, they spread their biota. They spread their culture, they spread their pestilence, and they spread war. The great Renaissance historian C.R. Boxer talks about the forgotten First World War. The Portuguese and the Dutch fought for 63 years on 7 seas and on 4 continents to control spice. You can't see, really, I don't know, but in the bottom right-hand corner is a cartouche. That cartouche talks about what's over in Asia waiting for European markets. Pepper, salt, cardamom, cinnamon. Europeans were delirious with desire for these goods. They were. And it caused war, mayhem, and it changed the course of history. So, going back to the Carta Marina, the 1507 projection, it didn't take long for the Spaniards to catch up. Because what happened when Spain conquered the Americas, they conquered South America, Central America, and they followed ancient trails up as far as Santa Fe. That was a tremendous amount of territory. And in harnessing all of this territory, they had to make political divisions. And they did it drawing lines, and the lines were very imprecise. They started out with 2 lines, and then they had 4 lines over the course of 200 years. So you had 4 political divisions over the entire New World. That's a lot of power for the conquistadors, who were then renamed the encomenderos, the big boss men, who controlled this area, all of them peninsulars, all of them directly related to Europe. They were all white Europeans. They had the pedigree, they had the territory, they had the permission, they had the license, and they had the slaves, and they dominated this world. They started to make municipalities called audiencias. Every audiencia in the old world, in the Spanish world, turns out to be a major South American capital. Bogota was an audiencia. Lima was an audiencia. Mexico City, the most important of them all, was an audiencia. In 1546, the Spaniards discovered something that changed the nature of the world again. They had already spread their biota. They had already spread their culture. They had already spread pestilence with smallpox that killed millions of people in the New World. But now they were going to spread the idea of war, because in 1546, the Spaniards discovered the Silver Mountain, the mountain at Potosí. 15,600 feet above sea level was a mountain, Cerro Rico, filled with silver. When the king of Spain, Philip II, heard of that news, and you can imagine it took a little while to portage that news back to the Escurial, he said, we're going to make an audiencia there. We're going to make an area that will be in charge of all of this silver. And he called it Charcas, and that became Bolivia. Bolivia today was basically an offshoot of Peru, which was lopped off of Peru to create a special district to control a mountain full of silver. And of course, there's only one problem with a mountain full of silver, 15,600 feet up in the air. How are you going to get it down? Well, not only that, how are you going to get it mined? And of course, the Spaniards used slaves from all over the Americas. But once they got the silver, they had to take it somewhere, and they couldn't really take it into the Amazon to the fluvial pathways of the Paraguay River or the Amazon, because then you'd have to deal with snakes and 2,000 miles of uncharted waterway and the Portuguese. Better to take it the other way, and the other way was through the Atacama Desert, which was a very difficult second best solution. When the Spanish began to do that, they needed an outlet. They needed a territory, and they created this port, Arica, which was part then of Peru, to get this silver out. And they take the silver up to the Panama, which was then called Darien. They'd take it off their boats. They'd go over the Cordilleras of Panama, and then they'd put them on ships in the Caribbean and try to take them back to Spain if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they would meet Dutch sea dogs, or they would meet Welsh pirates. They would meet English buccaneers, and they would meet the dreaded French corsairs who took the booty back to their devil island of Tortuga, where it created lots of mayhem as well. If they didn't take it that way, they went over to Manila. They conquered Manila, they made it a way station, and they used this silver taken from Potosí over to China to trade for goods. And it created global trade. For now, once the Spanish connected Bolivia to Asia, you had Asian commerce going to the Americas, going to Europe, going to Asia. The story continues to be told in that iteration. The only thing that changes is what the Atacama unveils. In the 19th century, the Atacama unveiled guano. Not everybody's preferred resource, but in a world where 90-some-odd% of everybody was tethered to the land and in need of fertilizer, all of a sudden you had a soluble form, a magical form of fertilizer. And it was so magical that Alexander von Humboldt saw what was going on when he spent 5 years in the Americas. He took it back and he said, this stuff really works. Pretty soon, everybody was clamoring for guano. And the Atacama Desert gave it up until after 40 years and using the coolie trade, slaves taken from China and Africa and prisoners, they mined completely bare the guano fields that had grown into mountains of guano over millennia. But just as that happened, the Atacama Desert gave up nitrates as the next mineral resource. And the nitrate trade exploded. Sorry for that pun. It exploded as war and munitions became a necessity. It exploded as Alfred Nobel perfected the use of dynamite, made it stable and deadly in 1867. And the nitrate dispute over who owned this stuff became a problem, and that's how Bolivia lost its coastline, in a fight over the desert sands that held the nitrate, saltpeter caliche. They lost the war over that issue. And when the Chileans took it over, the Chileans needed somewhere to take it. Instead, they relied on foreign capital. They relied on American, British, and German merchant fleets to portage this material all over the world. And penetrations came in 1860. There were no banks in this part of the world. 10 years later, there were many holding companies fortifying the trade with capital, foreign penetration. And to this day, the Bolivians claim that they lost the war because the Chileans were used as the proxy for the British financiers who penetrated their country. And that's the mentality that conforms with the neoliberal dispute that's going on today in the Andes. Things that were taken from the Bolivians were taken not by people in their nomos, by foreigners. The story takes another interesting turn because after the nitrate trade disappeared, and it did because German scientists in 1930, they found out a way to make it synthetically. Who needs to go to the Atacama Desert to do this anymore? They'll do it in their backyard. When the Germans synthesized this, there was the Atacama without any kind of resource available to be used until it gave up another trillion-dollar secret, and that was copper. The world copper trade is controlled by the Chileans, and all of it is going on in the mining districts of the Atacama. The biggest irony there is that mining copper is a tremendously water-intensive industry. There's no water in the Atacama. So there's a massive diversion of water going on to accommodate this globalized interest in the commodity. And that's another part of the story, because in the 1950s, Chile takes a dramatic turn ideologically. Young Chilean economists trained in private universities that were under attack by democratizing influences made a deal, largely due to University of Chicago connections, to establish an exchange program with one of the most rigorous, prestigious faculties in the history of academics. And from the 1950s to the early 1960s, 64 Chilean graduate students were placed at the University of Chicago's economics department, and they were freshly minted in Ph.D.s, and they went home. 20 more came after that. And then Mexicans came, Bolivians came, Ecuadorians came, Panamanians came. A whole generation of Chicago-trained Chicago boys went back to their homes to start preaching the gospel of neoliberalism, which had to do with divesting control over industries by allowing markets to work according to their mysterious invisible hand, to divest politics from economics and to let the market do the talking. This went nowhere in Chile. It went nowhere for 2 years until 1975, when the junta leaders of Chile, which took over in 1973 and dethroned the democratically elected socialist government of Chile. By the way, parenthetically, the democratically elected socialist won his seat with 31% of the vote. So it was a very tenuous democratic majority. His name was Salvador Allende. He was removed, and Augusto Pinochet and 3 other generals took over, but they couldn't run the economy. So they turned to the Chicago boys who had a book. They called it The Brick. It was a manifesto on how to shake out the bugs of a system, and it played well in Chile among the elites because they had this deep foreign penetration with regard to their extraction and their minerals that had been the basis for their ongoings and globalization since the Spanish came. And in very unauthoritarian ways, the Chilean generals divested themselves of control over the economy to these 30-year-old Chicago Ph.D.s who implemented an incredible policy of shock therapy to shake out all the bugs that had come with the development of the economy since the time of the massive latifundia organization of the conquistadors. And it was a terrible experience for Chile. Now they call it a miracle. But it took more than 10 years of incredible shock therapy and a military government that stood behind the economics to make it work. Other places tried this as well. Argentina did, but Argentina didn't have the kind of authority and the kind of structure and the kind of respect for the military that the Chileans had. So the Argentine experiment was a disaster, and it still is in a way. The Chileans are holding their opportunity up as a mirror for what should be done. No one ever asks the Chicago boys who are still in power. They are still chairholders in very prestigious universities all around Chile. No one ever asks them, well, did you see anybody get killed? Did you hear what Pinochet was doing? No, didn't know anything about it. They will say that. They know that there were terrible kind of economic consequences and there was a big recession, but they never saw anything bad happen, even though they were ministers in the government when the bad things were happening. The Bolivians, on the other hand, had this insular, suspicious view of foreign connections because they were, one, landlocked, and secondly, they didn't have the capital or the intellectual capital to compete with this kind of thing, so they became very insular. They suspected foreign penetration. They adopted certain kinds of devices to protect their industry, and they become a very difficult place to do business, notwithstanding the fact that they have reoriented the notion of privatization because there are big privatized problems with trying to consolidate the water issue. The Bolivians and the Chileans have completely different views about the nature of government, and the Chileans still have all of this emphasis from the conquistadors locked into their political elite system, whereas the Bolivians are led by an indigenous person, the first indigenous person ever take hold in the Americas, Evo Morales, but his orientation is markedly different. And this all brings us to today because the Atacama Desert has given forth one other miracle, and that is lithium. Lithium is powering your cell phones right now. Lithium is in your automobiles that are now electric. Lithium is in the nuclear industry. It's in the airline industry. And lithium is a miracle drug in medicine that deals with psychopharmacological problems, which, by the way, incidentally, were identified by George Winokur here at the University of Iowa. So the use of lithium for bipolarity problems has a real Iowa connection. But the real issue now is, where is all of this lithium going to come from? Bolivia has the lion's share. It puts them in the driver's seat, but they are too suspicious of foreign penetration to open up the way the Chileans historically have done so. And then you have the Argentines on the side, which are making a big play, except 2 weeks ago, the Argentine conservative government was was the recipient of a huge defeat in primaries. And so the Macri government, I don't know what they're going to do with regard to their opening up of their economy. But when the smoke clears, and when the jokes about Bolivia's pelagic power, die down, you're still going to have this fundamental problem about globalization and the way in which these countries markedly see differences in the neoliberal world. And they play against each other, and they are played against each other by external influences that keep the structural problem alive, and the results, accordingly, somewhat mysterious. Thank you.
All right, we'll start off with this one. What was the role of gold compared to silver? Wasn't Spain mostly interested in gold? What year was gold discovered in South America?
Gold was known to the Spaniards when they arrived. It was quite evident. And there were, in the pacification of the Incas, there were stories to be told about ransom being paid using gold. I don't exactly know when gold was discovered by the Spaniards, but silver bullion on the Pacific coast was a very vibrant trade for the Spanish as well. And so it was the demand for silver in Asia offset the demand for Asian emporium in Europe. More than that, I'm not really sure.
Can you tell us about the functions the Bolivian Navy plays now that they don't have a coastline?
They have Bolivia feels victimized. And so the narrative that associates with the need to project its military might as a former pelagic power, not that it ever was, serves a domestic purpose. It offsets lots of criticisms about the way Bolivia is oriented because it deflects attention from some of the circumstances that affect Bolivia. Bolivians don't like to remember that they picked the fight to begin with, that their misrule by their leaders in the 1860s resulted in phenomenal losses of territory just because of profiteering. When the leader of your country sells off part of the Amazon to put into his own pocket, that's a problem. But the idea that there's a play within the play, again, orients the discussion toward dramaturgy. There are political acts and there are different audiences that are being appealed to by the maintenance of this somewhat supercilious force. But it's not supercilious in terms of what Spaniards call emotivismo. It speaks to the national identity. It's no different than veterans who oftentimes wear or resuscitate things that happened in Vietnam for purposes of claiming an identity or a sense of moral purpose. So I don't dispute nor do I diminish the power of nationalism to affect politics the way it seems to be doing amid the Andean cone countries. And the Chileans have this identity too about about their role, which is the mirror image of the Bolivian role. Identity politics matters internationally, and that's what I think is driving this issue.
Now we've got a question about the United States' role in that part of the world, and I don't know whether the questionnaire thought this would be a good thing or a bad thing, but the question is, has anyone told President Trump about the Atacama?
I think when the lithium wars heat up, politics beyond President Trump will know about lithium. The Japanese have already tried to make a deal with the Bolivians. The Germans want to achieve dominance in this field and have tried to make a deal with the Bolivians. The Australians are the world leaders, but they have to pulverize their rocks in order to extract the lithium, which is a very cost-ineffective way compared to what the Bolivians have to do. They have to scratch the surface, create pools, and allow the filtration of lithium to evaporate. And it's quite cost-effective and easy for the Bolivians to dominate in this kind of way. They're calling it the next white gold rush. And the projections for demand involving lithium are phenomenal. They are in the triple digits in the next 5 years. So I think leaders around the world are going to want to get a piece of the lithium action. And they're already thinking about it, whether President Trump is or not.
A follow-up to that answer, a question about China's role in that rush for lithium.
China's interested in lithium. China's interested in every mineral that... China's involved in Latin America increasingly. China's taking advantage of very poor policy decisions made by the organization, by any former notion of Latin American sensibility or Pan-Americanism. One of the underexplored consequences of build-a-wall mentality has to do with the negative effects this has with regard to an esprit de corps of Pan-Americanism, which throughout the 20th century was a real idea. In fact, if you go back and look at the origins of the United States in the early 19th century with the talk of Henry Clay, with the first Pan-American Conference, the Panama Conference, back to the politics of Jefferson. He said a couple of bad things about the priestly ways of some of these countries, but he also said that there was a spirit of republicanism. There was a spirit of anti-colonialism, which we shared all around the Americas that made us part and parcel of a common circumstance. You hear none of that conversation today. It is a lost opportunity of identity, notwithstanding the fact that while Miller still remains the #1 surname in Iowa, good German name, there are many people named Rodriguez and Sanchez who are living in Iowa, who are changing the face of Iowa and changing the face of America, North America, I shouldn't just say America, right? And so the consequences to who North Americans think they are vis-a-vis South Americans or Central Americans is a little bit like what the Europeans thought about their relationship to the Americas. They were the ones who were in control. They were the ones who needed to be the guiders. And so we'll see where this goes, but it doesn't bode well for hemispheric relations when you try to separate yourself from a 300 and some odd year common identity.
Okay, we are now reached a point where I need to conclude the program. Can we thank Christopher Rossi again for his presentation? Again, thank you to our sponsors, University of Iowa Honors Program, International Programs, the U of I Public Policy Center, Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization, And also today's special sponsors, Midwest One Bank, Alice and Ken Atkinson, and Mason K. Braverman. Thanks again to City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs. Chris, as a small token of our appreciation, it's my pleasure to present you with a coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are adjourned.